And I felt that was about the proportion of the people in the city too. Most want to get back to normal. And they want to forget. So you know, you've got 90% of the people who can move into just ordinary space, and they can bring all their old habits. You know, doesn't need to be any kind of a radical space you don't know how to behave in. But for those 10% who see the future as something they have to create and invent, there is the space for that at the reconstructed end. The last one was called the High Houses. It's the devastated factory site with the Parliament building behind it in the foreground. And I said, look, build two exemplary houses that kind of reclaim the airspace. Because Sarajevo was, again, attacked from the hills with artillery, with cannons and mortars, you know, for 3.5 years. Did a lot of damage, heavy artillery from the Bosnian Serb army surrounding the city, cutting it off totally. I mean, I won't even go into the stories about no food, water, light, heat. It was a terrorist attack. It was the first terrorist attack of the New World Order, you know. And New York got its later. And what's funny is that at the time when this was happening in Sarajevo, people were saying, well, what's that got to do with us in the United States, you know? That's an old European problem. That's an old Balkan problem, you know. But now they don't say that anymore. I think people in the United States understand that this is not just an old Balkan problem, you know. It's a problem of our contemporary condition. So the high houses are built on steel beams that have been welded together, and they form these kind of flexible arms that rise up into the air, and the house is built on the top of those beams, and there are cables that pull the beams into tension, almost like catapults, and hold them in place through that kind of tension. So it's their desire to move, so to speak, that stabilizes them structurally. And you know, I always said that this was the perfect Sarajevan joke in a way, because Sarajevo humor is always about irony and contradiction. So here with the two houses that, you know, want to fly, but also want to be rooted in the ground in the same place, you know. So you want to have both at the same time. I'll briefly mention a couple of other things. I kind of got the reputation of being a guy who followed disasters and was trying to figure out how to rebuild after disasters, and I suppose there's truth in that. But what I was kind of moved by, I kind of got drawn into the Sarajevo and the Yugoslav breakup story. I kind of walked in with my eyes open, not knowing how it was going to develop, you know, in that country, or certainly not for me. But I began, it was a friend of mine in Japan, an editor of a magazine who, and it was, I guess, must have been 93 or 4, I can't remember the year, when there was a huge earthquake in the center of Japan. And there were incredible pictures of the towns, the buildings falling over and the expressways being twisted. And he sent me a fax. He said, you know, Lebbeus, that looks just like war and architecture, your war and architecture drawings. And I was so angry about that. You know, I said, of course I couldn't respond immediately, thank God. He's a good man. I was angry. I said, no, that was about intentional violence. You know, what they were doing in Sarajevo was intended to happen, but the earthquake just happens. You know? And then I started thinking about it. Well, what happens? Why do people get killed in earthquakes? They get killed because the buildings fall down on them. Now, the latest one's in Indonesia, and every year there's a new one. Pakistan last year, or earlier, even this year. The ground moves and the buildings collapse. So there's something wrong. There is intention here. People are dying because of let's say, the sin of omission versus the sin of commission. Because everyone knows the next earthquake's coming. These are all seismic zones with histories of earthquake. But when they rebuild just the way they did before, and the next earthquake comes and it falls down and they kill another 20,000 people, right? And so I'm exaggerating a bit, but not by much. So I started thinking about earthquake, and I won't go into a lot of detail. As usual, I feel free to explore ideas in my work. One thing about not having any clients, you know? I don't have anyone to blame my lack of imagination on. No one comes to me and asks me to design them anything. I can't imagine why, but since that's the case, I take the liberty to explore even ideas which may be, very questionable, and see where I can go with them. This was a group of houses. Again, the term house is a kind of generic term, and they're all grouped together here, but these I call the horizon houses, because the houses actually can be moved, like those Zagreb things carried around. There's the wheelhouse here, which can roll, and there are spaces inside you can live in, but the house, rolls. And so the space is the same. It never actually changes. But your relationship, because of gravity and the horizon, which is created by our sense of gravity, that changes. So if this room were suddenly tipped up on its edge, we'd be standing in a very tall space, right? We'd all be standing on that wall, or sitting, or lying, or whatever, looking up at this. And the room would be really the same, but our experience of it would be totally different. So the horizon houses were about spaces that can be reoriented, but themselves don't actually change, but our whole sense of them changes. Then there's another group of studies which probably related to the idea of that fragmented field drawing I was doing in the earlier 90s. This is at the end of that decade, 98, 99. I began to be interested less in the idea of objects, buildings as objects, and thinking more about terrain, landscape. What if we look at cities as landscapes, not as collections of objects? And what if we think of them as a kind of organic structure? Yes, of fragments, different parts, but as landscapes, rather than as objects on a shelf. And so I started doing drawings of, again, those kinds of fragmented parts, as trying to imagine a landscape undergoing continuous transformation, a built landscape, not the forest, not the mountains, but something totally constructed, like a completely constructed world. So I did drawings and made models, with my colleagues. We worked on these models to try to envision a kind of earthquake landscape, earthquake architecture, in a sense. Because, and I wrote an article called A Post-Biblical View of Earthquake. And I was saying to my group yesterday that the reason I said post-biblical is because from the Bible, in our Judeo-Christian tradition in the West, Western civilization, nature and the human were separated very early. As soon as humans wanted to have knowledge, which only God was supposed to have, we were just supposed to enjoy the fruits of the garden. As soon as people got the idea that they could have knowledge, they were thrown out of the garden, and they had to suffer. So here's Eden, here's nature, this beautiful natural thing that God created on one side, and here's humans on the other.